This week, a meeting of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are having a meeting in South Africa, and it will be the first time that Chinese new president Xi Jinping meets with other world leaders. However, many observers are trying to categorize the relationship that exists between China and Africa. And this morning, we're joined on the line with Ambassador David Shin. He is a former ambassador to Ethiopia, also an adjunct professor of international affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University. Ambassador, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Happy to be with you.
Let's speak about China's, I wouldn't necessarily say a renewed interest in Africa, but China has taken certainly an above average interest in the entire continent of Africa. Let's start with partnerships and different nations that China has been working with.
Sure, you're absolutely right. China has taken an extensive interest in the continent. It's always had an involvement there, going back to 1949 when the Communist Party came into power in China. But it stepped up significantly in about the mid-1990s, and then really became significant at the very beginning of this century, and has continued ever since, particularly in the areas of investment in terms of resource extraction from Africa, also an increase in foreign aid to African countries, and greater political and even security interest across the board.
When you talk about an historical involvement on the African continent, at least as it relates to the Chinese, as you said, during the 1950s, Beijing backed a number of African liberation movements seeking to unshackle themselves from colonialism. Can you give us some details about that?
Well, you're correct. It did select various groups that it supported in Africa. For example, Robert Mugabe, they're still the leader of Zimbabwe, and his liberation group at the time was one of them. And they also picked some groups that did not succeed in Africa. For example, in Angola, they were for a long time on the wrong side of the liberation movements. Even in South Africa, they had great difficulty in the beginning selecting one that came out on top, although they have very good relations now with the African National Congress in South Africa. They did not initially have a good relationship with the ANC. And in Mozambique, they eventually did support Frelimo, which came out on top. But in getting to that point, they supported other groups at various times, too. So their record was somewhat spotty in the early days of supporting liberation movements, but it is true that pretty much generally they did support one or another liberation group in virtually all of those countries that had them. Many African countries came to power without the need of liberation groups. The colonial powers gave them independence without any difficulty.
Africa has been an energy powerhouse to Asia, most notably to China and to Japan as well. Let's talk about the energy reserves that are present, especially along Africa's eastern seaboard, where it is obviously a bit of an easier travel route for exports to make it to the Asian continent from Africa. How much energy is Africa sitting on? Do we know?
Well, yes, we do have a pretty good idea. Approximately 10% of the world's known oil reserves are on the African continent, including North Africa. And probably the figure will be greater simply because so much of Africa is unexplored. And the thinking is that a higher percentage of new discoveries of energy will be in Africa as compared to other parts of the world. And I think that's a reasonable assumption. Interestingly, China is getting most of its African energy from West Africa, not from East Africa. The big exception in East Africa is Sudan, where until recently it was getting between 5 and 6% of its imported oil needs. But with the shutdown of oil production in Sudan, virtually nothing is coming out of Sudan for anyone. And as a result, the overwhelming preponderance of oil coming from Africa comes from places like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, the Republic of the Congo, where Xi Jinping will be visiting this month, and several other countries, Gabon. I think in the future there will be more oil going from East Africa to China because there have been new discoveries in Kenya and Uganda, and perhaps further to the south there are some interesting plays going on. But for the moment, it's largely a West African operation.
In terms of natural resources and raw materials, there have been reports indicating that the friendliness or the ease in which China is able to dialogue with many different African nations has hastened the killing of a number of elephants, rhinos, etc., being used for their parts and exported to China for a variety of different reasons, some involving religious rituals, others involving just eating. Have you found this to be the case, sir?
Well, the problem really surrounds the issue of elephants for their ivory and rhinos for their rhino horn. And the issue concerning elephants is perhaps the most significant one. It is true that China is the major producer of carved ivory, and you can find the ivory in many exclusive shops in China. The elephants are actually killed by Africans who are making very good money on the slaughtering of these elephants. But China has been a ready buyer of the elephant tusks once the elephants have been in effect harvested, and as a result, it is a serious threat to the African elephant, just as the killing of rhinos for their horn is also a serious threat to the African rhino, and China and other countries have been other Asian countries have been the principal buyers of rhino horn. So this is a serious problem in terms of those two commodities and those two animals.
This week, China's new president, Xi Jinping, is traveling to Africa for a meeting of the so-called BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The BRICS nations are meeting this week in South Africa, and a new announcement to come out of this meeting indicate that these groups of nations intend to form their own bank to not counteract, but to go around both the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, there has been discussion for several years now that the BRICS would create their own development bank. And it sounds like this may finally happen at the meeting in Durban at the end of this month. I don't see this so much as a counterpoint to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as it is a supplement to it. I think this bank could be significant in terms of the amount of money that it makes available, but I think it's questionable whether it will have impact that is equal to the World Bank and the fund, not to mention all of the other development banks around the world, like the African Development Bank, the Arab Development Bank. You put all these together, and you're talking about a very significant amount of money. I think that this is more of an effort to underscore the role of the BRICS in development of developing countries, and it may actually be a good thing. It will be done along regulations and rules that they agree to, which means it may be a little bit different than how the World Bank operates. But I don't particularly see this as a threat. And you also have to have agreement of all 5 countries as to how this works. And I'm not sure that Brazil and India and China, for example, are necessarily on the same wavelength as far as how you make a bank like this operate. They do have some different philosophical ideas.
As we get back to the relationship between China and Africa, the new Chinese president, Xi Jinping, will be traveling again, as I mentioned, to South Africa with stops in Tanzania. And I believe his final location that he will travel to in Africa will be the Republic of Congo. However, in an article published by the Financial Times, Nigeria's central bank chief Lamido Sansui is quoted as saying that Africans should wake up to the realities of their romance with China. And he draws an interesting analogy between the colonialism that Africa had dealt with for the previous 3 or 4 centuries, and saying that, in essence, China is going to take Africa's primary goods and then sell Africans back manufactured goods. He said that this is the essence of colonialism. What is your take on his statement? Is that accurate?
Well, there's growing pushback from Africans. Traditionally, it has been from African civil society, not African leaders like the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, who have been making these kinds of claims. So it's interesting that a very senior African official has now joined the fray. I think where I'm a little bit troubled in terms of how the language is used. On the one hand, it's absolutely true that China is taking primarily raw materials from Africa. About 85% of everything that it imports from Africa is in the form of a raw material, either energy, gas oil, minerals, things like cobalt, copper, iron ore, or in a few cases things like fish and hardwood timber. So that, and it's also true that it's selling overwhelmingly manufactured goods to Africa. So that part of the claim by the governor of the central bank is absolutely true. Now, whether that is quote, colonialism or neocolonialism is certainly subject to debate. And it really depends upon your definition of the term. And in my view, it's a bit of a stretch to call it certainly colonialism or neocolonialism. It may be mercantilism, but I'm not sure I would go along with the concept of calling it neocolonialism.
Indeed. Well, it will be interesting to see how the world's second largest economy in China continues its relationship building with what many would definitely not argue is a vastly untapped continent with unbounded resources in both people and materials. This morning, we've been speaking with Ambassador David Shin. He is a former ambassador to Ethiopia. He is also an adjunct professor of international affairs at the Elliott School at George Washington University here in Washington. Ambassador Shin, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Happy to join your program.